Ever feel like humanity is just one step away from a cosmic horror show?
Well, that's dead space for you. Specifically, we're talking necromorphs. You've sent over some seriously interesting articles and lore breakdowns, so I'm itching to dive in.
Luckily, I've got our expert here to guide us, ready to get sufficiently creeped out.
Let's unpack this nightmare.
It's important to understand right off the bat that these aren't your typical zombies.
Necromorphs are the result of a highly advanced form of biological manipulation, stemming from something called a marker.
Right, those mysterious monoliths everyone's always tripping over in space.
The articles mention the USG Ishimura. It's kind of ground zero for this whole mess, isn't it?
The Ishimura, a planet-cracking spaceship, becomes a horrifying example of what happens when advanced technology meets a force beyond human comprehension.
Imagine this vessel, a marvel of engineering, reduced to a floating graveyard by creatures born from a signal.
And the 2023 remake really brought those visuals home. I can only imagine the terror of seeing that level of detail, especially with the expanded lore.
The remake uses its visuals to underscore a chilling truth.
This signal the marker emits, it doesn't just reanimate dead tissue.
It can actually influence living minds, too.
So it's not just about gruesome transformations, there's a psychological element as well.
Absolutely. Think of it as a psychic virus.
The marker signal can cause paranoia, hallucinations, even violent tendencies.
It warps your perception of reality, leaving you vulnerable to its influence.
That's chilling. It's like it preps you for transformation even while you're still alive.
But if you are unfortunate enough to die on the Ishimura, say hello to a very unpleasant afterlife.
The transformation process is the stuff of nightmares.
Imagine this. The body begins to contort, almost as if an unseen force is puppeteering it. Bones shatter and reform, twisting into unnatural positions, defying any semblance of human anatomy.
Organs, once vital for life, are repurposed into grotesque mockeries of their former selves.
Reading that made my stomach churn. And the worst part is, they don't even need blood to survive.
Precisely. They are sustained by the marker signal, making them incredibly resilient and challenging to stop.
So, no aiming for the head like a traditional zombie flick.
Aiming for the head is actually the least effective approach. You'll need to rethink your entire strategy when it comes to dealing with a necromorph.
But we'll get to that a bit later.
All right, fair enough. Now let's talk about the different players in this cosmic horror show.
First up, slashers. They're iconic for a reason.
Slashers are often the first necromorph encountered, and their appearance cements the horrifying reality of the situation. They're fast, aggressive, and those signature blade arms are incredibly dangerous.
Not exactly what you want to run into in a dark hallway.
Especially since they're deceptively intelligent. Slashers have been known to use the ship's ventilation system to their advantage, flanking unsuspecting prey.
They can even feign death, waiting for the perfect moment to strike.
Talk about adding insult to injury. And as if the adults weren't bad enough, you sent over some information on lurkers.
The fact that these creatures originate from, well, babies,
Yeah.
that's just messed up.
Lurkers are a tragic example of how the marker's infection doesn't discriminate. Formed from the reanimated corpses of infants, these creatures might seem small, but they pack a serious punch.
Those projectile attacks are brutal, and you can't even rely on them being slow-moving targets, can you?
You can't outrun them, and their projectiles can quickly drain your health and ammo if you're not careful. They are a haunting reminder of the indiscriminate and ruthless nature of the necromorph threat.
Adding another layer to this horror show, we have the pregnant necromorphs. They're kind of hard to miss with that giant, pulsating, well, you know.
Pregnant necromorphs represent another stage in the marker's terrifying life cycle. And as you pointed out, their method of giving birth is something straight out of a nightmare.
Talk about going out with a bang. It seems like every corner you turn on the Ishimura, something wants to rip you limb from limb.
And some necromorphs are a greater threat from afar. Take, for instance, the Guardians. You'll find them fused to the wall, often in strategic locations.
I can already imagine the jump scare waiting to happen there.
What makes the Guardians so unsettling is their backstory.
These were once human, victims of the initial outbreak on the Ishimura.
Now, horrifically fused with the corruption, they serve as living defenses.
Their corruption. What exactly is that?
Imagine a pulsating mass of organic matter spreading like a disease throughout the ship, consuming everything in its path.
That's the corruption. It's intrinsically linked to the marker's signal, a physical manifestation of its power to warp and consume.
The Guardians, in a way, are just one horrifying byproduct of this phenomenon.
So we've got these former humans, now monstrously fused to the walls, spitting projectiles at anyone who comes close.
The projectiles are bad enough, but the Guardians can also launch those explosive pods we discussed earlier, the ones filled with necromorph biomass.
Okay, seriously. It's like the Ishimura itself is trying to kill you.
In a way, it is. The ship has become an ecosystem of horror, with each type of necromorph serving a purpose in the marker's twisted agenda. And speaking of twisted, we haven't even touched upon the brutes.
Oh, right. The brutes. You mentioned them earlier. They're the real heavy hitters, right?
Brutes are essentially walking tanks. They are heavily armored, incredibly strong, and as you might imagine, not very friendly.
The articles mentioned something about organic bombs.
Ah, yes, their signature move. Let's just say you don't want to be on the receiving end of a brute's digestive system.
Okay, I think I just lost my appetite. But it sounds like brute force isn't always the best approach with these creatures. You mentioned the dividers earlier. They're the ones that split apart.
Precisely. And it's not just a simple division. When a divider sustains enough damage, its head detaches, becoming a creeper, a fast-moving parasitic horror that can crawl through vents and even take over other corpses.
So you're telling me even dead bodies aren't safe?
Not with a creeper on the loose.
Oh.
And as if that wasn't enough, the rest of the divider's body explodes into those smaller spider-like components.
Like a terrifying game of whack-a-mole, except the moles are trying to eat your face. Is there anything on this ship that isn't trying to kill you?
Well, there are the Weezers. They aren't directly hostile, but they can still be a significant threat.
How so?
Weezers are essentially giant mutated lungs that roam certain areas of the Ishimura.
While they don't actively attack, they emit poisonous gas, forcing you to rely on your suit's limited oxygen supply.
So it's not enough to just avoid getting ripped apart. You have to worry about suffocating, too. Speaking of volatile, we can't forget about the exploders.
Ah, yes. The name says it all, doesn't it?
You're not going to tell me they're friendly, are you?
Let's just say you'll want to maintain a healthy distance when dealing with an exploder. They're essentially living bombs with a large pulsating sac on one arm, just begging to be detonated.
Okay, this is starting to feel less like a spaceship and more like a haunted house designed by a sadist, and I thought the regenerating limbs of the hunter were bad.
The hunter is a unique case, even among necromorphs. It's a relentless killing machine, capable of regenerating lost limbs in a matter of seconds.
So how do you even kill something like that? Asking for a friend who may or may not be trapped on a spaceship with one right now.
Conventional weaponry won't put it down for good. You'll need to get creative, use the environment to your advantage, maybe lure it into a trap or two.
It's like a horror movie boss that just won't stay dead. Speaking of bosses, some of these necromorphs sound like they could headline their own horror franchise.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, the Ishimura is home to some truly massive and terrifying creatures. Take, for instance, the Leviathan. It's a massive, tentacled monstrosity that lurks in the food storage facility.
Something tells me it's not there to offer snacks.
You would be correct. The Leviathan is incredibly aggressive and surprisingly agile for its size. It can launch projectiles, use its tentacles to crush you, and even spit acid.
So, a bit more to worry about than just a slasher with extra limbs.
Quite a bit more. And then there's the hive mind, the creature believed to be the central intelligence behind the necromorph outbreak.
It sounds like we're moving from the terrifying to the downright Lovecraftian.
It's an apt comparison. The hive mind is a gigantic worm-like creature that controls the lesser necromorphs through a telepathic link. It's a final boss encounter you won't soon forget.
And just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, the research you sent mentioned something called phantom variants.
The phantom variants are something you'll only encounter in New Game Plus. Think of them as the ultimate test for Dead Space veterans.
I'm almost afraid to ask, but what makes them so special?
Imagine taking all the worst aspects of the necromorphs we've already discussed. The speed of the twitchers, the durability of the brutes, the regenerating capabilities of the hunter, and combining them into a single nightmarish creature.
Okay, I think I'm starting to understand why our listener was so interested in survival tips.
It's understandable. Facing a necromorph infestation is a daunting task, even for the most seasoned space engineer.
And that brings us to Isaac Clarke. He's got his work cut out for him, doesn't he?
He does, but thankfully he's not entirely defenseless.
Right, he's got that cool suit.
Yeah.
And the articles mention some pretty creative weaponry.
Isaac's engineering rig suit is more than just protective gear. It enhances his strength, allowing him to handle heavy weaponry and navigate zero-gravity environments with relative ease.
Okay, so the suit's got him covered, literally. But what about taking down these creatures? A wrench can only get you so far, right?
You're right about the wrench. Luckily, Isaac has access to a variety of repurposed mining tools that prove quite effective against the Necromorph threat.
Repurposed mining tools. Sounds messy.
Messy but effective. Take, for instance, the plasma cutter. This bad boy can sever limbs with incredible precision.
So that whole dismemberment is key thing we discussed earlier. It's not just for show.
Not at all. Strategic dismemberment is crucial for survival. Removing a slasher's blade arms, for example, can significantly reduce its threat level.
It's a good thing Isaac is handy with a plasma cutter then. What other tools are in his arsenal?
There's the line gun, which is fantastic for crowd control. It fires a horizontal blast of energy that can cut through multiple limbs at once.
Okay, that sounds brutal. But what about when you need that extra bit of stopping power?
That's where the stasis module comes in. It's a tool that allows Isaac to temporarily slow down necromorphs, giving him valuable time to aim for those critical dismemberments.
It's like a pause button in a horror movie.
Exactly. And if he needs to get creative, he can also use kinesis.
It allows him to manipulate objects in the environment, including, well, necromorph limbs.
Wait. He can use their own limbs against them.
That's right. Imagine using kinesis to launch a slasher's severed blade arm back at it. It's all about using the environment and even the necromorphs themselves to your advantage.
Survival in Dead Space sounds like a macabre game of chess. You need to think several steps ahead and use every tool at your disposal.
Precisely. Now, shifting gears a bit, we can't talk about Dead Space without delving into the role of unitology.
It's more than just a background detail. It adds a whole other layer of complexity to this story.
Right. The articles mention this religious group believes the markers are somehow divine.
In a nutshell, yes. Unitology preaches that the markers are not alien artifacts, but rather divine instruments of human evolution. They call it convergence, a merging of the living and the dead into a single transcendent entity.
But we know the markers are responsible for this horrific outbreak, for the creation of the necromorphs. It's like worshipping a plague.
It's a perfect example of blind faith colliding with terrifying reality.
Yeah.
Unitology's belief system is ultimately what allows the marker's influence to spread unchecked.
It adds a whole new layer of fear to the game, doesn't it? Knowing that this group is actively working to further the marker's agenda, even as the world descends into chaos.
Absolutely. And in the middle of all this cosmic horror is Isaac, a man driven by love for his missing wife, Ellie. He's fighting against impossible odds, not for some grand mission, but for a deeply personal reason.
It makes him a much more relatable and sympathetic protagonist, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. Now, for those who haven't experienced Dead Space firsthand, especially the 2023 remake, there's a feature you should know about: the Intensity Director.
Right. The articles mentioned it, but what is it exactly? How does it work?
Imagine an unseen puppet master controlling the game's atmosphere, constantly shifting and changing to keep you on edge. That's the Intensity Director. It can alter enemy spawns, environmental effects, lighting, even audio cues.
So even if you think you know what's coming, the game can still surprise you.
Exactly. It keeps the player in a constant state of tension, never knowing what's lurking around the next corner or when the next jump scare is coming.
So what's the takeaway here? What should our listener be thinking about after this deep dive into the horrors of Dead Space?
I think the beauty of Dead Space is that it's more than just a horror game. It's a story about the potential consequences of our own ambition, a cautionary tale about tampering with forces beyond our comprehension.
It's a reminder that sometimes the greatest horrors are not found in the vastness of space, but within ourselves.
Well said. And with that chilling thought, I think we've successfully explored the depths of the Dead Space universe.
This deep dive was definitely intense. To our listener out there, if you do decide to brave the USG Ishimura yourself, remember what we've learned. Dismember strategically, watch out for unitology propaganda, and always keep a spare oxygen tank handy.
Sound advice. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and may your journeys be free of cosmic horror.